1963 is a year where everything still feels possible. The Beatles aren't legends yet. They're not untouchable icons. They're not the greatest band of all time. They're not even fully polished. They're hungry, young, working constantly, and trying to figure out how far this thing can actually go. And before we get into this, if you think early Beatles music was just simple love songs and screaming fans, stick with me. Because hidden inside those early records are the blueprints for everything that came later. And honestly, Do You Want to Know a Secret might be one of the clearest examples of that. Because this little song quietly reveals something huge about the Beatles before the world fully understood who they were becoming. Now let me ask you something. When people talk about early Beatles songs, what do they usually mention? Please, Please Me, She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand, the big explosive hits, the screaming, the energy. But Do You Want to Know a Secret feels different immediately. Slower, softer, almost fragile. And that's important because in 1963, the Beatles weren't just trying to sound exciting anymore. They were trying to sound personal. Now here's something a lot of people don't realize. John Lennon wrote the song, but he didn't write it for himself. He wrote it for George Harrison. And that matters, because early Beatles records still operated a little differently than people remember. John and Paul were clearly emerging as the primary writers, but they were still trying to establish the group as four personalities, not just two leaders with backup musicians. George needed songs. George needed moments, and Lennon understood something important. George's voice worked better on gentler material, not shouty rock and roll, not Little Richard-style screaming, something warmer, more intimate. So, Do You Want to Know a Secret becomes one of George Harrison's earliest spotlight moments. And honestly, you can hear the nerves in his voice. Not bad nerves, real nerves. He sounds young because he was young. Only 20 years old during these sessions. Now think about that for a second. 20 years old, and recording songs that would still be discussed 60 years later. That's insane pressure when you really think about it. Now let's talk about where the song actually came from, because this part is fascinating. John Lennon said the inspiration came from a Disney movie. Seriously, specifically, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. In the film, Snow White sings, "Want to know a secret? Promise not to tell?" That line sticks in Lennon's head. Now imagine that for a second. One of the foundational songs of Beatlemania traces back to Disney animation. And honestly, that tells you something important about Lennon early on. Before the sharper wit, before the cynicism, before the psychedelic years, there was still softness there. He was absorbing melody from everywhere, not just rock records, movies, pop standards, show tunes, everything. And you can hear that melodic sweetness inside this song. Now let's step into the studio, EMI Studios, Abbey Road. And this is where people really misunderstand early Beatles recordings. Because when you hear these songs now, they sound effortless. But the recording technology was primitive compared to what came later. Two-track recording, minimal overdubbing, very little room for mistakes. The Beatles had to perform tightly because there weren't endless editing options. Now here's another thing most people miss. The band was exhausted. Absolutely exhausted. By 1963, they were performing constantly. Live shows, travel, radio appearances, TV spots, and then rushing into recording sessions. The pace was brutal. But sometimes that pressure creates energy, and you can hear it in these early recordings. They feel alive because they were happening fast, not endlessly polished. Now here's where George Martin becomes critical. And honestly, George Martin may be the single most underrated figure in Beatles history. Without him, the Beatles still become successful. But do they become the Beatles? That's a different question, because Martin understood arrangement, tone, space. And with Do You Want to Know a Secret, he helps keep the production restrained. Nothing overwhelms George's vocal. The guitars stay clean. The rhythm section stays soft. Even the harmonies are carefully controlled. Now let me ask you something. How many producers would have tried to make this song bigger? More dramatic? More commercial? Martin understood that intimacy was the hook. That takes restraint. Now let's talk about George Harrison specifically, because this song matters enormously for him. George often gets framed as the quiet Beatle, and later in life that becomes part of his mythology. But early on, that quietness was also uncertainty. John and Paul were dominant personalities, dominant writers, dominant voices. George was still finding himself, and songs like this gave audiences a glimpse of him as an individual, not just the guitarist standing to the side. Now here's something interesting. George reportedly wasn't fully confident as a lead singer yet. You can hear moments where he's almost carefully stepping through the vocal instead of attacking it. And weirdly, that vulnerability helps the song. Because do you want to know a secret isn't supposed to sound aggressive? It's supposed to feel private, almost like someone leaning closer to tell you something important. Now let's talk about Beatlemania itself, because this song arrives right before everything completely explodes. And I mean explodes. By late 1963 into 1964, the Beatles stop being a band in the normal sense. They become a cultural event. And that changes how people hear these songs. Suddenly, every lyric matters more. Every smile matters more. Every member develops a fan base, and George Harrison quietly builds one of the strongest teenage followings in the group during the early years. Now think about that. This soft little song helped establish George Harrison as more than the other Beatle. That's historically important. Now musically, the song itself is deceptively simple. That's another Beatles trick people underestimate. Simple doesn't mean accidental. The chord changes move smoothly. The melody stays memorable without sounding forced. And the harmonies? Already unmistakably Beatles. That blend becomes one of the defining sounds of the decade. Now here's the fascinating part. At this stage, the Beatles were still heavily influenced by American artists, the Everly Brothers, Smokey Robinson, girl groups, Chuck Berry. But they were already recombining those influences into something distinctly their own. And Do You Want to Know a Secret is one of those transitional songs where you can hear it happening. Now let's talk about the emotional side of the song, because this matters more than people realize. The lyrics aren't complicated, but they create intimacy. The song feels like a conversation, not a performance. And in 1963, that emotional accessibility was a huge part of why the Beatles connected so deeply with young audiences. They didn't sound unreachable. They sounded human, approachable, almost like boys next door who somehow happened to become famous overnight. That image mattered enormously. Now here's a question. Would a song this gentle survive in today's music industry? Seriously. Could a young band release something this soft and emotionally straightforward now without drowning in irony or overproduction? Because part of what makes early Beatles music special is sincerity. They weren't trying to sound detached. They weren't hiding behind sarcasm. And audiences responded to that honesty immediately. Now let's talk legacy. Because Do You Want to Know a Secret is not usually listed among the Beatles' greatest songs. And maybe that's fair. It's not A Day in the Life, it's not Something, it's not Hey Jude. But historically, this song matters because it captures a moment before the mythology hardens, before the experimentation, before the pressure nearly destroys them, before the business chaos, before the psychedelic years. This is still a young band discovering itself in real time. And honestly, that innocence disappears faster than people realize. By the time the Beatles stopped touring in 1966, they are completely different people. By the end of the decade, they barely resemble the band from Please Please Me. But Do You Want to Know a Secret preserves that early moment perfectly. Young voices, simple arrangements, optimism, possibility, and the feeling that music might still just be about connection, not empire building, not legacy, not cultural dominance, just connection. And maybe that's why the song still works. Not because it's flashy, not because it's revolutionary, but because it feels genuine. And genuine never really goes out of style. So let me ask you, what early Beatles song do you think deserves more respect than it gets? And do you prefer the raw early Beatles years or the later experimental era? Drop it in the comments. I want to know where you stand on that debate. And if you're just here to drift back into those early black and white Beatlemania years for a little while, then relax and spark one up and keep that turntable spinning.